Textbooks imply European naval dominance was inevitable, uninterrupted, and technologically decisive. That assumption collapses when one admiral forced Europe into defensive treaties across its own coastline. He was not a pirate myth. He was not a footnote. He commanded fleets that dictated terms to empires. What most curricula omit is not his existence, but Europe's inability to defeat him. That omission begins with how naval history is framed. European textbooks move from discovery to dominance with little resistance acknowledged. Opposition appears briefly, then disappears. But the record does not support that smooth progression. A coalition of Europe's most powerful navies once assembled specifically to destroy one man Eskimo. They failed, not symbolically, operationally, and that failure forced a rewrite. The contradiction sits quietly in treaties, correspondence, and emergency reallocations of resources. It is not hidden. It is simply not taught. What follows is not an interpretation. It is documentation aligned to timelines Europe preserved and then minimized. The admiral in question was known to European courts long before modern nation-states existed. He was identified by name, rank, and command authority. He was described as the Moorish admiral in diplomatic records. That descriptor was not incidental. It shaped how he was categorized, then later obscured. European naval doctrine assumed superiority through canon standardization and formation tactics. Those assumptions did not survive contact with his fleets, and this is where the record shifts. Before the confrontation, European states treated him as a regional nuisance. After the confrontation, they treated him as a strategic threat. That change is measurable. Ports were reinforced. Trade routes were rerouted. Convoys doubled. These were not reactions to rumors. They were responses to loss. What textbooks usually call Mediterranean piracy was in fact organized naval warfare. It followed chain-of-command discipline. It deployed coordinated squadrons. And it was led by an admiral whom Europe negotiated with directly, not defeated. Negotiated. That distinction matters. Negotiation implies leverage implies parity. This alone destabilizes the accepted hierarchy taught in naval history surveys. But the contradiction deepens. European archives preserve letters requesting ceasefires, prisoner exchanges, and maritime corridors. These letters were sent upward, not downward. Kings authorized them. And this is where the explanation usually offered stops working. The common framing claims these negotiations were temporary expediencies, short-term compromises. The timelines disagree. These arrangements persisted across decades. They survived leadership changes on both sides. They outlasted technological upgrades. Europe adapted around him. That adaptation is visible in ship design. Broader beams, heavier stern artillery. These changes were reactive. They followed losses at sea, and those losses were acknowledged internally. Publicly, a different story emerged. Victories were celebrated selectively. Defeats were categorized as weather anomalies or piracy incidents. The admiral's command was reframed from organized navy to criminal irregularity. This reframing had consequences. Once criminalized, his victories no longer disrupted the narrative of European ascendancy. They could be dismissed, not analyzed. But contemporaries did analyze them. Venetian senators debated his maneuver patterns. Spanish commanders adjusted patrol doctrines in response. French diplomats sought alliances rather than confrontation. This is not speculation. It is preserved in minutes, orders, and correspondence, and it creates a problem for the dominant story. If Europe was technologically and organizationally superior, why did it avoid decisive engagement? That question rarely appears in textbooks. Instead, the admiral's identity dissolves into vague labels. Moor, corsair, privateer. Each label removes state legitimacy. Yet the record repeatedly contradicts those labels. He held a formal rank within an imperial navy. He commanded dockyards, arsenals, and payrolls. He coordinated campaigns across regions. This was not freelance violence. And this is where institutional silence becomes visible. European naval histories often jump from medieval galley warfare to Atlantic dominance. The Mediterranean becomes a transitional space. In that transition, his name fades, but the decisions made because of him remain. Spain fortified North African holdings beyond initial projections. Italy invested disproportionately in coastal defenses. France entered strategic cooperation that violated religious alliances. These were not ideological gestures. They were survival calculations. And this is where power reversal becomes uncomfortable. Europe was not projecting uncontested force. It was responding to it. For extended periods, European trade moved only with permission or protection negotiated indirectly through him. That reality does not fit the educational arc of progress. So it was softened. Naval supremacy became a story of invention rather than confrontation. Opponents became unnamed, but the Admiral remained documented where decisions required honesty. In budgets, in emergency councils, in fortification blueprints, what followed was acknowledged privately, but excluded publicly. As European empires expanded, historical narration centralized, curricula standardized. Complex adversaries were reduced. This admiral did not disappear because records were lost. He disappeared because records conflicted with a usable past, and that choice had long-term effects. By the time modern education systems formed, the Mediterranean was reframed as a prelude, not a battleground. Naval mastery appeared linear. Students inherited that structure without seeing its omissions. The media followed suit. Dramatizations focused on explorers, not defenders. Naval conflict became discovery-driven. The Admiral's victories did not advance that plot, so they were categorized as anomalies. But anomalies that force policy shifts are not anomalies. They are turning points. And this is where the pressure increases. Because once you identify the pattern of omission, you start seeing its mechanism. Legitimate command reclassified as criminality. State conflict rebranded as disorder. Strategic stalemate reframed as inevitable progress. None of this required falsification, only selection. By the end of this period, Europe taught naval history without naming the commander it could not neutralize. That absence became normal, and modern audiences inherited a version of history where resistance appears weak, brief, or non-existent. Yet the infrastructure of fear remains visible in the record, and we have not yet reached the moment when Europe tried, decisively, to end its command. That attempt exists. It was coordinated. It was overwhelming on paper, and it failed. It failed not because of the weather, but because the planning assumptions were wrong. European commanders expected fragmentation where coordination existed. The operation was designed as a sweep, multiple fleets converging to. The goal was elimination, not deterrence. Internal correspondence described it as final. No further negotiations anticipated. No contingencies were prepared for a stalemate. That confidence did not survive contact. The Admiral anticipated convergence before it materialized. Signals were intercepted. Movement patterns were inferred from port behavior. This was not improvisation. It was counterplanning. European fleets advanced, expecting pursuit. Instead, they encountered absence. Supply lines stretched, morale thinned, and this is where the record becomes uncomfortably precise. European logs document weeks of waiting without engagement. Coalitions began disputing the command hierarchy. Operational unity fractured. Meanwhile, trade disruptions increased elsewhere. The Admiral did not meet force with force. He displaced it. That displacement exposed a vulnerability Europe rarely acknowledges. Coalitions require time. Empires move slowly. By the time commanders realized the maneuver, the campaign logic collapsed. And this is where the outcome is quietly reclassified. No decisive defeat is recorded. No victory claimed. Instead, the operation simply ends. Ships return. Funding is redirected. Correspondence shifts. Tone. What had been final becomes unsustainable. And this silence is telling. European histories typically celebrate failed campaigns as lessons or martyrdoms. This one is summarized briefly, if at all, because acknowledging failure would require naming who caused it. That name does appear elsewhere. Insurance records spike. Merchant guilds petition for renewed protections. Port authorities revise schedules. The Admiral's command remains active, and Europe resumes negotiation. Not publicly. Administratively, tribute is reframed as trade facilitation. Ransoms are called diplomatic exchanges. Language shifts to preserve hierarchy, but functionally, the arrangement persists. European vessels sail with understanding, not dominance. This pattern continues until another transition begins. Atlantic expansion redraws priorities. Mediterranean pressure becomes inconvenient to emphasize. And here is where erasure accelerates. As colonial narratives require clear superiority, earlier stalemates become liabilities. They complicate the story of inevitable control. So, classification changes. The Admiral's fleet is no longer discussed as a navy. It becomes a problem for law enforcement. This reclassification is institutional. Legal frameworks shift from warfare to criminal suppression. Naval engagement becomes policing. Once reframed, Earlier treaties lose legitimacy retroactively. Negotiation with equals becomes negotiation with criminals. That distinction allows historians to dismiss concessions as temporary corruption. But the documents do not support that dismissal. The same states that criminalized his command later honored similar agreements elsewhere. The standard was not behavior. It was identity. And this is where the educational consequence solidifies. Students are taught about naval innovation without seeing what forced it. They learn about dominance without acknowledging dependency. The Admiral's strategies influenced patrol spacing, convoy formation, and maritime intelligence protocols. These adaptations are studied abstractly. Their catalyst is unnamed. What remains is technique without context, and this omission carries forward. Modern media reproduces the same structure. Complex resistance is flattened. Opponents are interchangeable. The Admiral becomes invisible, not disproven. This invisibility protects the narrative, because naming him would require admitting Europe was contained repeatedly, not by chance, by strategy. And this is where modern framing becomes relevant. When contemporary education presents global power as historically one-directional, it relies on selective memory. That memory was curated, not inherited naturally. Archives still hold the contradiction. They hold letters of hesitation. They hold budgets, marked urgent. They hold defensive planning maps. These are not symbols of dominance. They are symptoms of constraint. Yet constraint does not fit triumphalist progression. So it is edited out. This editing was not performed once. It was reinforced across generations. Each retelling simplified the opponent. Each simplification justified the next omission, until the Admiral's name no longer disrupted anything. But disruption is exactly what the record indicates he caused. He forced Europe to pause, to adapt, to negotiate. Those pauses shaped maritime history more than most celebrated victories, and they shaped modern perception by being excluded. This exclusion is not accidental. Institutional history favors continuity over contradiction. It preserves momentum by smoothing resistance. That smoothing required removing figures that broke the arc. The Admiral was one of them, not because he fit a heroic mold, but because he exposed vulnerability. Vulnerability is rarely taught, especially when it belonged to empires that later controlled the curriculum. And this is the final pressure point. If naval supremacy required avoidance, negotiation, and reclassification, then dominance was not absolute. It was managed. That management involved narrative choices. Those choices still shape what is taught, filmed, and remembered. The Admiral's erasure is not an isolated oversight. It is a case study, a documented example of how history absorbs contradiction without acknowledging it, and the record remains intact for anyone willing to read past the summaries. The question is no longer whether Europe defeated him. The archives already answered that. The question is why that answer was made so difficult to encounter.